I thought fate wore a lab coat and smelled like taco grease. In the 90s, I drove 95 miles for love and the low hum of aquariums. He taught animals. I learned his rooms by heart. Then, after midnight, tangled in sheets, he told me my body made me hard to want. The room went quiet, except for filters and my pulse in my ears. Months later, he said I didn't know enough science. Funny, because I knew exactly what I was seeing. Glass tanks by a window, scales and fur under buzzing blue, paperwork he wouldn't file. I heard the snap of a disposable camera, felt my smile steady. He wanted Latin names. I learned the anatomy of consequences. I still remember the first time I met Jake. It was the 90s, and everything in my world felt wide open, like a road stretching somewhere I hadn't even imagined yet. We were introduced through mutual friends, and within a few months we were talking about moving, both of us, 3,000 miles across the country. He was headed to grad school. I was planning a move with friends, just 90 minutes away from where he'd be. It felt like fate was nudging us into place, aligning our timelines in a way you only believe in when you're young, and the future feels gentle. We clicked so fast it made my head spin, and I thought, this is it. This is my person. Jake had two sisters and a younger brother, all of them kind and sharp and funny in different ways. I fell in with them easily, like slipping into a familiar song. Every time I saw them, the feeling of belonging sank in a little deeper. Because he was in school and I was working, we made it simple. On weekends, I drove to him. He rented a house with two other guys in his program, messy kitchen, thin walls, the whole grad student aesthetic. Money was tight, so we did what people do when they don't have much. Cheap taco dates, long walks, movies on someone's battered TV, and endless evenings at the house where he bred small animals to sell. Jake was an animal sciences PhD student, so the cages, tanks, and heat lamps didn't faze me. I actually loved being around the animals. There was something soothing about the soft rustling and the warmth of the rooms. I liked that world, and I liked the people in it. I became close with Mary, the wife of Jake's advisor. She worked in administration at the university, and she had this calm, grounded presence that made me feel seen. We had lunches on campus sometimes, and she'd listen with this steady smile, like she knew exactly who I was and trusted me to figure things out. Meanwhile, Jake worked as a TA, and through him I met other people in his program. Weirdly, I made friends faster than he did, something I didn't think much about at the time. Looking back, I wonder if that ever bothered him. About 2 years into dating, something snapped, though I didn't know it right away. We were lying in bed one afternoon, the quiet kind that happens when the sun is lazy and time feels suspended. I was half dressed, half dreaming, when he said, out of nowhere, that he was concerned I'd gained weight, and it was making it harder for him to be attracted to me. I sat up, the air suddenly heavy. He wasn't worried about my health or my stress. No, it was about him finding me less attractive. I remember this quiet clarity settling over me, the kind that feels like stepping onto solid ground. I told him, very calmly, that if it bothered him so much, maybe he should make sure there was better food around when I visited, because crackers and cheese were not exactly meal prep. I was 23, and even then, I knew when something wasn't my problem. I had maybe gained 10 pounds since we met, still the same size, a US 6'8", and I wasn't about to accept shame for existing in my own body. 10 pounds since we met, still the same size, a US 6'8", and I wasn't about to accept shame for existing in my own body. So I asked him, without raising my voice, "What's your solution?" He looked at me blankly and said, "I guess you should try to lose weight." And I said, "No, I'm not doing that. So what are you going to do about it?" He blinked and said, "I guess nothing. I wanted to let you know how I feel." I said, "Cool, thank you." I put my clothes back on, got under the covers, slept, and drove home the next day like nothing had happened. I didn't know it yet, but the ground under our relationship had already shifted. 3 months later, he called me to break up. Almost 3 years, gone with a sentence. And his reason, this ridiculous, brittle sentence, was, "You don't know enough about science." He said he couldn't have a conversation with me about his work without using common names instead of scientific ones, like that was some insurmountable moral failing. I remember staring at the wall with the phone to my ear and thinking, that's not it. That's not the real reason. I asked him again. He swore it was the truth. A month after that, he came by to return something of mine, and I didn't play nice. I confronted him right there in my apartment. I pushed and pushed until he admitted it. He'd been seeing one of his undergrad students, Meg, 19 years old. He was 26, and her TA. I don't remember everything I said, but I remember the heat in my face and the tightness in my chest. My roommate stepped in with the kind of energy that makes you feel safe. He told Jake that if he didn't leave, he'd be thrown off our second-floor balcony. Jake left. The silence after the door shut felt enormous. And then something shifted in me. I burst into stunned laughter. Meg. I had met her. Once at a barbecue, she'd spilled something on her pants, and Jake had asked me to loan her some sweats. I couldn't, because I was a size 8 and she was a size 18. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Nothing. But I realized in a flash that his comments about my weight had been a coward's exit ramp, a way to try and get me to leave so he wouldn't have to say the truth. He liked bigger women, he was seeing a bigger woman, and he'd tried to make me feel small while he did it. Also, for the record, he said those things to me at 1 in the morning. I lived 95 miles away. We'd literally just had sex. What did he think I was going to do? Storm out and drive an hour and a half into the night? Even then, it made no sense. But the riddle of it wouldn't matter for long. I emailed his roommates. It was the early 2000s, and email was where you put the things you didn't want to say on the phone. I told them we'd broken up, thanked them for always being kind to me, and said goodbye. They wrote back. They both knew about Meg. They told me they were the ones who had pushed Jake to tell me the truth, or they would. That's when he broke up with me with the "you don't understand science" excuse. One of the roommates, George, was this super nice, super cute guy, the kind you're grateful exists in a story like this. He offered to help me collect the few things I still had at their place. He also suggested I come up for the weekend, that we go out and have fun, drink, dance, laugh, all the things Jake didn't want to waste money on. I said yes. But what I had in mind went a little beyond cocktails and closure. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to discover how satisfying the truth could be when it finally stepped into the light. When I got to the house, George let me in while Jake was gone. The place smelled like pine shavings and warm plastic. That slightly sweet scent of heat lamps and tank lids was gone. The place smelled like pine shavings and warm plastic, that slightly sweet scent of heat lamps and tank lids. I walked through quietly, looking at every setup, labels, water bottles, breeding boxes, tanks by windows. I knew what to look for. I'd paid attention more than he ever gave me credit for. I took photos of everything. There was an endangered species in his care, an unreleasable animal he'd taken in from a rescue. He wasn't breeding it, but he was required to file paperwork and pay a small fee, $25. He refused. He said he didn't want the government in his business. I took a photo of that animal, the enclosure, the notes pushed under the tank. There was also an animal in a tank by a window that wasn't allowed in the state at all. If you stood outside, you could see it right through the glass. I photographed that too. My hands were steady. I knew exactly what I was doing. That night, George and I went out. We hit a couple bars, told a few stories to the right people, and laughed until our faces hurt. It wasn't about being petty. It was about reclaiming the oxygen I'd given away. We stumbled back around midnight. Jake and Meg were on the couch watching TV. I walked in wearing a short dress and messy hair, a little drunk and very done. George practically carried me down the hall. I spent the night in George's room. He was a gentleman through and through. But we also made sure to let the performance play. Quiet giggles, a door that didn't latch, his parade past the living room in boxers once or twice for effect. I did not care what Jake believed. I cared that he heard what he'd taught me. I was done being small. In the morning, I walked out to leave, still in my rumpled dress, hair unbrushed, eating a donut I'd picked up from a box in the kitchen. Jake looked at me, red-eyed, and told me I didn't have to act like a whore in front of him. George beamed at me, leaned down, and kissed the top of my head. Meg looked ashamed, staring at an invisible spot on the floor, maybe realizing exactly what line she'd crossed. I took a breath, looked Jake in the eye, and said, "Have fun with my leftovers," then walked out. I thought maybe that would be my revenge. Turns out, it was only the opening act. The next day, I got the film developed. The gloss of fresh prints in my hands felt like holding answers. Then I called the State Office of Fish and Wildlife. I told them what I knew, what I'd seen, and asked how to make a report. I sent in my statement with the photos, overcrowding, the endangered animal without paperwork, and the illegal species in plain view. I don't know what I expected, but I felt something steady settle in my chest. Meanwhile, there was the university piece. Turns out Jake wasn't exactly beloved by his peers or by his roommates. But luckily for me, I was. George and the other roommate offered to file formal complaints that a TA was sleeping with one of his students and giving her favoritism. That night at the bars, we'd made sure the right ears heard the right story. It wasn't a big program. Word travels fast when women need to know who's abusing authority. George and the other roommate put in their complaints. The wheels started turning. With all of that in motion, I called Mary, Jake's advisor's wife. She already knew we'd broken up and had rolled her eyes at his pathetic, "you don't understand science" line. I told her the truth. He admitted to sleeping with a student, and I had it in writing. I forwarded her the email. On the phone, she went very quiet and then very calm. She said she would make sure it was investigated, and then I heard her call to her husband in the background to tell him to start whatever came next. For a few weeks, the air hummed with possibility. Her husband in the background to tell him to start whatever came next. For a few weeks, the air hummed with possibility. I went on with my life, breathed, slept, worked, and then George called me, practically giddy. State Fish and Wildlife was at the house. They were there with clipboards and quiet voices, asking questions. George told them he'd be happy to help them with whatever they needed to know. Meg was there too. When they asked, she told them, as far as she knew, all the animals belonged to her boyfriend Jake, and that everything was legal. That cleared George and the other roommate quickly, which must have been a relief. One of the animals lived in the backyard in a way that suggested a neighbor might have noticed something. While the officers were there, they knew to step around, look through the back window, and see the more serious problem, the illegal animal by the glass. Since George was on the lease, he was able to let them inside to check communal areas. They stayed a while, took notes, and then left to return with a warrant. When they came back, they took all the animals and inspected Jake's room. The only creatures they left behind were some guppies in a tank. Small, harmless, just bubbles and bright flickers in green water. Meg tried to reach Jake, but couldn't. This was pre-smartphone, pre-texting on the fly. She ended up driving to campus to find him. I could picture the scene and felt a calm that tasted like justice. Then there was the federal money. In animal sciences, a lot of research funding comes from the government. Right around when he broke up with me, Jake had gotten an EPA grant. So I called the EPA and asked, carefully and clearly, how to report that a recipient of federal funds was being investigated for illegally harboring endangered animals. I wasn't hysterical. I wasn't even mad anymore. I was precise. Long story short, he lost the grant. He had to make restitution for what had already been used, close to $30,000, and he would never be eligible for another federal grant again. On the state side, he avoided jail time because the animals were in good health, but he lost all of his breeding stock, which was worth thousands of dollars. He was fined $15,000, and the 2 protected animals were transferred to a nearby nature center. People sometimes ask me if I set out to ruin his life. I didn't. I set out to tell the truth to the people who needed to hear it, to keep animals safe, and to make sure a TA stopped exploiting his position. If consequences followed, that was on him. I think about that girl I was, driving 95 miles on a Friday night with a bag of clothes and an open heart. I think about the moment in bed when he told me I was becoming less attractive to him, and how something inside me refused to bend. That refusal saved me. I walked through that fire and came out different, clearer, stronger, a little sharper at the edges. And if you're wondering whether I regret any of it, the photos, the calls, the reports, the answer is no. I learned that sometimes closure isn't a conversation, it's a consequence. In the end, I didn't need him to apologize. I didn't need him to understand me, or my body, or my worth, or my voice. I just needed to tell the truth and stand still while it did its work. And the best part? I found out what I'd suspected all along. I hadn't been the one who didn't understand. I'd understood everything, just in time to walk away and never look back. I thought we were chasing the same horizon, until I realized I was there to make his version of himself feel bigger. When he reduced me to pounds and called my curiosity a deficit, I finally heard what I'd been avoiding. I was listening. He just didn't like what it revealed. My curiosity a deficit, I finally heard what I'd been avoiding. I was listening. He just didn't like what it revealed. The theatrics felt good for a night, but closure came from choosing receipts over rage and letting the people whose job is to care do the rest.